Well, first and foremost, I absolutely want to welcome everyone this late afternoon to what is the second Maud Sulter Annual Lecture event. My name is Debbie Jackson. I am the Head of Fine Art Critical Studies here at the School of Fine Art, and I'm also the BA Programme Lead as well for Fine Art. Outside, after the event, we're going to be selling the new publication from our incredible speaker today, and it's titled, yay, oh yeah, okay, absolutely, why not? Why not? It's called Our Eyes Are Commonly Tender, Visual Justice in the Filmmaking of Pratibha Parmar. And now, to begin proceedings proper, I want to hand over to our wonderful chair for this event. So please join me in welcoming Sandra Yeaman up to the stage.
Thank you, Deborah. What is that weather like? It's so good to welcome you all here for the second annual Maud Sulter Lecture. And thank you for coming, even though the weather's so awful. As Deborah said, I'm Sandra Yeaman. I'm the curator of Discomfort and head of strategy at the Hunterian Glasgow's University Museum. But I'm not here with that hat on today. Today I'm here as the chair of Street Level Photoworks with our wonderful partners, the Glasgow Women's Library, the Glasgow School of Art Exhibitions and Glasgow School of Art Fine Art Critical Studies at this important event. And the Maud Sulter Lecture aims to amplify the legacy of the artist Maud Sulter as a photographer, as an artist, a writer, poet, curator and organiser. And it is with great pleasure that we welcome another artist who had the good fortune to know and work with Maud, our guest speaker this afternoon, Pratibha Parmar, who I will say more about in a few minutes. Firstly, Maud. Maud Sulter, born in 1960, passed away in family photographs from Scotland and Ghana. A parallel collection, second a decade or so of poems, was also published. It was another 10 years before another public-facing exhibition took place, Passion, at Street Level in 2015. And that brought together some of the key bodies and chapters of Maud's photographic practice. Now, Maud was one of the three celebrated historic writers at Glasgow Women's Library, the very first Open the Door Women's Writing Festival in 2017. And GWL continued to highlight her work in subsequent festivals, for instance, hosting a workshop about Maud's life and work in collaboration with Rhubarba Gallery in 2021. And Glasgow Women's Library hold Rhubarba Gallery's publication, Passions, along with several other publications by Maud. And she was added to the new biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women in 2019, and Maud's entry was written by Glasgow Women's Library's co-director Adele Patrick. Now, Maud has been undergoing a much-needed reprisal by institutions and artists since that exhibition in 2015. In 2022, the National Trust for Scotland staged an exhibition at Pollock House. Later in that year, the aforementioned artist collective Rhubarba produced an important short film which celebrates and reflects on Maud's legacy, which was screened here at Glasgow School of Art, as well as several other venues. And earlier this year, the Tramway staged the ambitious You Are My Kindred Spirit, drawn upon the artist's rarely exhibited moving image and spoken word archives. Now, the event today, therefore, feels very timely and very fitting with our special guest, Pratibha Parmar. Emerging from her deep involvement in the anti-racist, transnational and black feminist movements of the 1980s and 1990s Britain, Pratibha's films have shaped the politics of feminist, queer and diasporic visual cultures for over 4 decades. From experimental shorts to activist documentaries and feature-length works. Parmar's cinematic language operates as an act of visual justice, a concept she coined to describe a queer diasporic strategy for generating networks of solidarity, art and pleasure. In 1990, Pratibha's short film Bangra Jig was originally commissioned by Channel 4 through the Scottish production company Fields and Frames for Glasgow 1990, European Capital of Culture, and was one of a series of works by artists produced as television interventions. Now, the work explores in visual superimpositions the South Asian experience in Scotland, and in it a young woman walks through the city of Glasgow, once known as the second largest city of the British Empire. Her eyes reflect on the wealth symbolised in the textures of the city's architecture. And this is against echoes of colonial memories and is the living memory of today's cultures of resistance. So through dance and music, young South Asian people celebrate desire and self-pride. Pratibha is an award-winning filmmaker whose groundbreaking films centre marginal stories in bold, creative ways. Pratibha has collaborated on a film project with Pulitzer Prize winner author Alice Walker, made a film on Angela Davis, one of the most wanted women by the FBI. That's Angela Davis, not Pratibha. Yet. And stood on the stage at the iconic Castro Theatre in San Francisco to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award from the renowned African-American poet June Jordan. One of Pratibha's first videos, Sari Red, lives in the permanent collection at MoMA in New York City and the Pompidou Centre in Paris. A globally recognised filmmaker and human rights activist, her films Warrior Marks and Kush helped gain much-needed rights for women and girls, as well as contributing to the visibility of marginalised LGBT communities. My Name is Andrea 2022 premiered at the prestigious Tribeca Film Festival to rave reviews, and Sari Red and Reframing AIDS were included in the groundbreaking exhibition Women in Revolt at Tate Britain, which also travelled to the National Galleries of Scotland in 2024. So with all that, I want to welcome Pratibha Parmar.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you all for coming here today on a Friday afternoon, Halloween, in fact, and it's raining outside, so it's wonderful to see you all and some familiar faces, some who travelled from different cities, so thank you for being here with me. So I want to start by thanking the fantastic group of organisations and individuals who extended this invitation to give the Annual Maud Sulter Lecture. It is truly an honour, and I'm really happy to follow my friend Jackie Kay, who gave the inaugural lecture last year. Also want to thank Street Level Photoworks, Glasgow Women's Library and Glasgow School of Art, and also Natalia Palambo, who suggested me for this talk. I want to thank the Maud Sulter estate, especially Deborah Cherry. I don't think she's here, but she answered my multiple emails with great patience. Today, as you all know, is a very special day. Most people know 31st of October as the day of Halloween. But some of you may know that Halloween came out of what is known as Shimmering, the Celtic New Year, when it is believed that the veil between the living and the spirit world is thin. I know little about this tradition, but what I do like is this idea of liminal time and permeable boundaries between worlds. Maud pushed different kinds of liminal spaces and boundaries between visibility and invisibility, between presence and absence, and between the margin and the center. This day and its symbolic meaning feels like an opportune moment to bring Maud into the room with us. So I want to start off by showing two clips of Maud's work, grounding us in her work, in her voice. Let's see. Should work.
The ballad o' the wing, the ballad o' the wing, I before. The ballad o' the wing, the ballad o' the wing, aye, the ballad o' the ballad o', the ballad o' the wing. A story to be told, a story to be told, aye, there's a story aye to be told about the wing again. The ballad o' the wing, the ballad o' the wing, aye, the ballad o' the ballad o', the ballad o' the wing. There was a fearful time, no so long ago, when from the lands of Europe there was a terrific stench, and it hasn't gone away. For that was the day when history stood still, and with winged feet or broken backs they shipped us overseas. Aye, the wing was o'er the ships, those dark big-hulking ships. Inside was just as dark as well, we living live black folk. Aye, some went o'er the edge, and some made it across, and some walked back 'cause they wouldn't think that they would want to be there. Aye, back across the water to where they had come from. Aye, Africa, she called her name, and they knew where to go. Aye, their feet walked high above the crashing o' the waves. Aye, their feet walked high above the water, and some say they could fly. Oh, the ballad o' the wing, the ballad o' the wing, aye, the ballad o', the ballad o', the ballad o' the wing.
That's from a video called The Sphinx that Maud had made for an exhibition at the Chisenhall Gallery. And it was an exhibition of Lubaina Hamid's work, but Maud had this video installation there. And when I first listened to The Ballad of a Wing, the sonic vibrations of this haunting lament on the profound violence of enslavement and voyages across hostile oceans lingered and reverberated, her recitation mesmerizing. I found there's a beautiful intimacy in the sound of her voice, in the words and their meaning. So these words and these lyrics are actually generated in Maud's favourite font, it was the Apple Chancery font, and that was her favourite font. With these words, I'm particularly struck by Maud's use of flying, both as a metaphor and myth. And Maud returns to this image of flying in her video, No Oxbridge Spires. Moving between geographies and temporalities, she invokes the borderlands of personal and collective history as a Scottish Ghanaian woman. Recounting the story with wit and dry deadpan humour. So this is a second clip of work from Maud.
I've never been able to push a pram straight, which is probably something to do with the fact that once I was able to fly. Well, of course, it's a well-known fact that black people could fly before slavery days, and that our wings are reforming to this very day. But the incident which I am here recounting was rather more perambulatory. There I was in my pram, only a few months old. As I was 4 pounds at birth, I don't reckon that I weighed more than half a dozen bags of sugar at the time. Anyway, it was a windy day, and my mum and my auntie wanted to go to a draper's shop along at Crown Street in the Gortles. Well, as I said, it was windy, and my grandad said, "Don't you be taking my precious," that's what he called me, "don't you be taking my precious out in that weather." Well, my mum and my auntie persisted, so there we all were, setting out on the curtain mission with my big cousin Linda, or was it Yvonne, who was only 6 at the time. Well, You wouldn't think that between them, my mum and my auntie had brought up 4 children, because weren't they daft enough to put up the hood so that I wouldn't be in a draught? So there we were, halfway along Caledonia Road, when whoosh, off I fly like the ancestors on my daddy's side, over the railings into the park, which, dear reader, I feel obliged to point out was only yards from the Clyde. My mum rushed into the park and found me still strapped in and, so the story goes, smiling sweetly. My auntie, on the other hand, had to go to hospital to get stitches because she held on to the pram when it took flight and was impaled on the railings, and my cousin lost a couple of milk teeth. Still, we've all dined out many times on this adventure, each rendering our own version of the tale, of course.
That formal relationship between the sonic and visual choices in both these videos offer us insight into Maud's practice rooted in her multiple genealogies. In my presentation today, I aim to contextualize Maud's work within the genesis of the Black Arts movement in the UK in the early 1980s and explore her overriding project of putting black women in the center of the frame. Secondly, I will draw out some thematic overlaps between my work and Maud's. The connective tissues in our work are many and part of a much larger picture. The early 1980s saw a significant moment of emergence, a time of fast-growing black artists network. It was not yet a movement. That would happen soon enough. It was in the midst of this time of flourishing discussions, community arts events and exhibitions that I met Maud. My own focus at the time was on writing critical discursive essays around identity and visual representations. I had come through postgraduate studies from the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, co-founded by Professor Stuart Hall at Birmingham University. It was here I developed my discipline of critical thinking in relation to contemporary culture. And it was at this time I started to understand the power of representation and its active creative role in the way we think about the world and our place within it. Over the decades, the foundational core of my practice as a filmmaker has been to engage the image as a site of struggle, challenging the power relations that determine who is seen, how they're represented, and what forms of visual expression are made possible. I call this a practice of visual justice. In 1982 and in 1988, I wrote 2 essays, Hateful Contraries and Transitory Moments, for the photography journal 10/8. I interrogated photographic representations of Asian women in mainstream media at the time, invested in perpetuating stereotypes of Asian women as meek and mild. These harmful stereotypes became a rationale for heinous sexual assaults on South Asian women coming to England. Sexual assaults enacted and sanctioned by the British government via their virginity testing immigration policy in the late 1970s. And in the second essay, at Transitory Moments, I asserted the desire for Black and Asian women to represent ourselves authentically and argued for and defended our right to be artists. So there's the articles. And in the Critical Decade issue of 10/8 in 1992, the editors identified these 2 essays as mapping out crucial landmarks in Black cultural theory of the 1980s and indicating where we might be going in the 90s. I mention these because it's crucial to map artists, particularly Black women artists' work, within a historical, political, and cultural trajectory. partly because such a mapping gives us clues as to how the foundational visual syntax for any artist's methodology and practice may have come about. Mapping was a key element of Maud's practice. Her prolific visual output shows an abiding commitment to creating what I like to call a cartography of presence, particularly in reinscribing the historical presence of black female representation within the Western art canon. Maud's statement for the catalogue of the thin black line at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in 1985 tells us how acutely aware she was of the difficult task ahead of her. For our creativity, this is a quote from Maud, from the Thin Black Line catalogue. For our creativity to shimmer golden through the white fog of mediocrity, we first have to recognize that for many of us, our life will be a constant battle. Inside, we feel the need to fight, and for a time, possibly for our ever, it is possible to be frozen by fear without recognizing why we are afraid or what it is we must fight. Not facing up to the continuing contradictions which face women living globally in the late 1980s and beyond will not make them go away. Strength can be gained by facing up to those factors which conspire to contain us. Maud Sulter exemplified this strength, a tenacity, and an unwavering commitment to face up to those walls and fences, transforming them into doors that she could walk through, so that her own creative practice, as well as those of other black women, would shimmer golden. That's Maud with her grandmother. It's just a really adorable photograph. The through line in Maud's multifaceted practice was, as she declared, to put black women in the center of the frame. She did this as an artist, as an exhibition curator, as an award-winning poet, a writer, and a publisher, and a co-founder of Urban Fox Press. She was also the owner of Rich Women of Zurich Gallery in London's Clerkenwell. Maud once said, "Being visible can be dangerous, but being invisible eats away at your soul." What does it take to bring yourself forth into the world as an artist if you are a black woman or a woman of color? What inner strength does it take to assert oneself as a creative practitioner in worlds and cultures bereft of any representation of black women artists? In a world that has no or little expectation of you? How does the violence of racism, of policies of dehumanization, alter and inform our lives, and in turn our creative practices? What does it take for you to fly towards your dreams and desires? For you to be willful enough to claim the identity of an artist, when there is a faint, tenuous lineage to call upon, or no known lineage at all? I have asked these questions of myself in recent years while writing my memoir. My arrival in England as a working-class immigrant at the time of Enoch Powell's virulent, racist rivers of blood speech sparked increased attacks on black and Asian people on the streets and in our homes. It was a rough landing. It was also a time of the rise of fascism and fascist organizing, not unlike what we are seeing right now. An artist isn't born, an artist is made from numerous impulses, gestures, and desires, from our personal genealogies and our historical realities. We emerge from moments and movements. we emerge from what stories we encounter when we read books, which writers we read, the people we meet, who not only inspire us, but also believe in us. We emerge too from what music makes our bodies move and our hearts expand, what paintings compel us to look and look again. We emerge from who we find community with. Maud was an avid reader and taught herself everything. I learned this quotidian personal fact from reading an interview with Lubaina Himid, who was Maud's artistic collaborator and life partner for a significant number of years. What she said about Maud was deeply resonant for me. And this slide is just about see Maud and Lubaina there, and they were co-editors of a magazine called Feminist Art News, and this was a particular issue that they did. Lubaina said about Maud, if I were to make a list of all the books that she, Maud, owned or read, I would still be making it. She would read 3 or 4 books per week, political books, art books, poetry books, novels. She read all day, every day, and was a phenomenally self-educated person. If she was thinking about doing a work around circus people in Nazi Germany, then she would read all around that, embody the knowledge, and then write something as if she were there. I identified with Maud's lust for reading. I identified because I too am an avid reader. Books opened me up to other kinds of dreams and other kinds of possibilities. The 1980s was a transformative decade. At the start of the decade, artists Eddie Chambers, Keith Piper, Claudette Johnson, and Donald Rodney staged an exhibition of work of young black artists at Wolverhampton Art Gallery, the first of its kind. In interviews with some of the artists, you hear how they faced hostility and hatred in trying to bring their work into a closed-off art world and institutions whose willful ignorance of black artists was shocking but not surprising. One of the key moments in the British Black Arts movement was the exhibition The Other Story at the Hayward Gallery in 1989, curated by Rashid Areen. Featuring artists of African, Caribbean, and Asian backgrounds, the show revealed how these artists had been marginalized in the West. Yet one unfortunate fact about this exhibition was how few women artists were featured. Especially since the milestone year for black women artists was not long before then, when in 1985, 11 black and Asian women, including Maud, were featured in the game-changing The Thin Black Line, curated by Lubaina Himid at the ICA, and who at the time, the ICA gave Lubaina just the corridor to mount the exhibition. This is the catalogue of the original Thin Black Line. For many in the mainstream art world, the exhibition in 1985 was their first exposure to the work of black women artists. 40 years later, this year, in 2025, Lubaina was invited back to curate a 40-year anniversary celebration of that show. She invited back not only the original artists, but the few others too, including programming a season of some of my films at the ICA. For her, Connecting Thin Black Lines, which is the title of the exhibition, was a way to show connections and intimacies forged across different art forms in the 1980s and 90s. No longer confined to the corridor, the work took over the whole of the ICA. But just imagine, it took 40 years, how slow the change was, how frustratingly slow the change had been. At the ICA exhibition this year, Lubaina invited poet Romy Smith to present a live performance titled Tracing the Thin Black Line. Romy, inspired by a copy of Maud Sulter's Zabat, a poetry collection gifted to her at 16, drew a compelling line of creative influence from Maud's words into her own poetry. This is Romy, who's also here in the audience with us. And I love this, she's holding the joy of sex and Zabat in her other hand. And that's another one at the show. So here's a Polaroid, courtesy of Ingrid Pollard, who's also in the audience with us. And in the Polaroid is Trevor Matheson, who's a sound artist. That's me in the pink. That's Ingrid Pollard, and that's Shaheen Hack. And this was at the opening of the Thin Black Line in 1985. And we did recreate this moment this year at the opening of Connecting Thin Black Lines with Claudette Johnson, because that's a painting by Claudette Johnson that we're standing by. But Claudette joined us in the recreation with her painting behind us. But I couldn't locate that Polaroid, otherwise I would have showed that to you. A year after the Thin Black Line in 1986, I made my first video, Emergence. The title Emergence came effortlessly, because it was a nod to the emergence of the prolific, life-saving, life-giving, artistic expressions flourishing all around us. It was an emergence, too, of my voice and practice as an artist, the start of my journey in visual storytelling with the moving image. Emergence focused on 4 artists, Sutapa Biswas, Mona Hatoum, Mei Ling Jin, and Audre Lorde. And this experimental video had a prose poem narration braiding the visual and sonic layers, illuminating the work of these artists through their words and visuality. I'm going to just show a short clip.
When I was a girl, I lived in a box. That is why my head is square. I lived on jam and played on the streets. I survived in this hostile landscape. And when one day I was chased from school, I turned and punched their teeth out. Too harsh, you say? I don't agree. They would have smashed my head in. One day I learned a secret art. Invisibleness, it was called. I think it worked, as even now, you look but never see me. I was born in the southern hemisphere, in the early hours of the dawn, and when I die, I shall return to a place I call my own. Only my eyes will remain, to watch and to haunt, and to turn your dreams to chaos.
The Thin Black Line had exposed me to Sutapa Biswas's work, and especially her painting Housewives with Steak Knives. It was, and I remember it still, it was an electrifying moment when I first saw Housewives with Steak Knives. Sutapa's housewife was Kali, the multi-armed Hindu goddess of destruction and banisher of evil, brandishing a steak knife in one hand, while in another she holds a beheaded white man with white hair. For me, the painting signposts the layered narratives of histories of colonial violence, female resistance and rage, and gives a nod to a lineage of women artists. In one of her many hands, Kali holds a flag bearing an image of the painting Judith Slaying Holfens by Artemisia Gentileschi, a 17th century Italian painter. In this painting, Judith is beheading a general, a visual revenge for the rape Artemisia had suffered at an early age. It was the first time that I had seen a reference to Western feminist art tradition deployed alongside an Indian female archetype. I'd never seen such a startling juxtaposition before. So the painting and the painter were my first casting for emergence. This was us filming Pratibha and the painting in her apartment in Leeds while she was still a student there. And the painting was so large, and we only had her kitchen wall, so it was all rolled up at the bottom. And that's Trevor Matheson on lights and Eddie George on camera. And both of them at the time were part of the Black Audio Film Collective. I had decided to feature Mei Ling Jing's poetry in the video, the clip that you just saw. I knew her work as a co-editor of her poetry book, Gifts from My Grandmother. This was when I was part of Sheba Feminist Publishing Collective in 1984. This is her poetry collection that I co-edited, and I also designed the cover of the book. It was my first design of book cover design. And so this right here was another direct link to Maud, who was the first black woman to join the all-white Sheba Feminist Publishers in 1982. Maud did not have an easy time as a member of this collective. She wanted to put together a book on black women artists and for Sheba to publish it. Sheba was a small, not-for-profit collective with few resources. Much to Maud's understandable frustration, the publication didn't materialize. Instead of letting go of her vision for such a book, Maud, in fact, put together a publication in 1990 of passion, discourses on black women's creativity, and published it through her own publishing company, Urban Fox Press. Hers was an attitude and an orientation many of us shared at the time. If they won't, we will, by any means necessary. The photographs in this book are all by Ingrid Pollard. The cover of the book is the artist Nina Edge, one of her pieces of work. In the introduction to Passion, Maud writes, "It is a glowing testament to those black women who came after me at Sheba that they put together a dangerous knowing for black women poets and charting the journey, writings by black and third world women." Once again, right here is the larger canvas of our connecting networks. As a member of Sheba, I had co-edited A Dangerous Knowing, the first book of its kind, a collection of poetry by 4 black women, British black women, Jackie Kay, Barbara Burford, Gabriella Pierce, and Grace Nichols. And I was also one of the editors of Charting the Journey, writings by black and third world women. These overlapping circles of connections where we all, each in our own way, laid the groundwork, planted and nourished each other's visions, all of which in turn gave rise to multiple creative projects, with reverberations to this day. We were publishing, writing poetry, painting large canvases, taking photographs, making videos, and performing groundbreaking work in art galleries that had never encountered the range of artistic possibilities coming through the diasporic black and brown women's communities. One trajectory of Maud's work was what Gayatri Spivak called tracing the itinerary of the silence. In her milestone publication, Can the Subaltern Speak? The subaltern, the marginalized, the other, whose voice is either never produced or is indistinguishable from an echo. The voices and images of black women that were never produced or were indistinguishable from an echo were plenty. This absence of black women as artists within historical narratives led the writer, Alice Walker, to look for her artistic antecedents, and in doing so, she spoke specifically of her own mother's garden and how this was the place of her mother's creative expression. Her mother's screen of blooms became the bedrock of Walker's own creative expression. In 2012, I was at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, going through Alice Walker's archives as part of my research for my film, Alice Walker, Beauty and Truth. In a small box with loose odds and ends, I came across a cassette labeled Voice Messages, read the Pulitzer Prize for The Color Purple. As I started to listen, I had literal goosebumps. I didn't hear any phone messages. Instead, I heard a young Alice Walker's voice reading out loud her essay, In Search of My Mother's Gardens, from 1974. And there was an intimacy and a vulnerability in her voice that brought me right into her subjectivity. It was one of those rare archival finds bringing to life a significant moment in Black feminist history and literature.
In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, honoring the creativity of the Black woman. I notice that it is only when my mother is working in her flowers that she is radiant, almost to the point of being invisible, except as creator, hand and eye. She is involved with something her soul must have. She is ordering the universe in the image of her personal concept of beauty. Because of her creativity with her flowers, even my memories of poverty are seen through a screen of blooms.
In Search of Our Mother's Garden, she's really talking about Black women's effort to make beauty in a world that denied that they had anything to do with beauty. And she talked about the beauty of her mother's gardens. It's a place, as I think somebody profoundly said once, no tree ever called me digger.
That book can be retitled The Lost Lives of Black Women. You know, the millions of Black women who never ever got to be and do what they fully wanted to do.
What did it mean for a Black woman to be an artist in her grandmother's time, in our great-grandmother's day? It is a question with an answer cruel enough to stop the blood. Did you have a genius of a great-great-grandmother who died under some ignorant and depraved white overseer's lash? Or was she required to bake biscuits for a lazy backwater tramp when she cried out in her soul to paint watercolors of sunsets, or the rain falling on the green and peaceful pasture lands? Or was her body broken and forced to bear children who were more often than not sold away from her? 8, 10, 15, 20 children, when her one joy was the thought of modeling heroic figures in stone or clay.
In the 1980s and 90s, many of us in the UK were influenced by and were in dialogue with African American women writers and artists. We exchanged ideas and built networks of mutual support, forming a transnational feminist circle. Maud had interviewed Alice Walker when she visited the UK in 1989, and Walker's words had had a profound influence on Maud's practice. I don't read history for facts, I read it for clues, Alice Walker had written. Maud acknowledged how important this insight was for her and how necessary it was for creating narrative work. Maud went on to use this quote from Walker in her series of photographs, Zabat, as a framing text for the photograph of Cleo, the Muse of History, portrayed by and performed by Dorothea Smart, a literary activist, artist, and poet. Maud also included Alice Walker as one of the muses. I'm always fascinated by what other artists read and what key texts might have influenced them. One such text I found while looking through Maud's archives at the Tate recently was a photocopy of Michelle Cliff's 1982 article, Object into Subject, Some Thoughts on the Works of Black Women Artists. In this essay, Cliff argues that black women artists combat the double objectification they face under white supremacy and patriarchy by transforming the object of racist and sexist imaginations into the subject of their own self-definition and commentary. One could say this is exactly what Maud did with Zabat, coming as it did from her commitment to put the black woman center stage as the subject of her own definition. Zabat, the series, portrayed contemporary black women, including Maud, alongside 8 other black artists, each one personifying an ancient Greek muse, subverting the conventional Western art tradition of white women portraying muses and goddesses. This was Maud, personifying the epic goddess of poetry. It's Lubaina Hamid, Delta Street. These were images of defiant grandeur, where the women hold their own authoritative presence, as one critic commented. However, what really interests me is how Maud was not only making a political intervention, but was equally concerned with identifying a formal aesthetic approach that worked in tandem with her intention to subvert the Western canon. The materiality of the actual frame within which the photographs sit was traditional ornate Victorian gold. And with this choice of frame, I hear Maud quietly screaming, think about the unforgivable invisibility of black women within historic photography. Think too about the colonial violence of racist, sexist depictions of black women who appear in the margins of the frame, if at all. The formal choices and experimentation many of us were engaged in our multivariant creative projects and practices acted not only to subvert the Western canon, but could be seen as a refusal to follow the rules we never had any part in setting. As a self-taught filmmaker, my visual language is a language born out of a simmering cauldron of my passions, my diasporic sensibilities and histories. When I made my second video, Sari Red, I was hailed as a video artist. At the time, I was completely unaware of what a video artist was. And in making the video, I was guided by my own instincts and impulses. And when MoMA in New York and the Pompidou Center in Paris bought the videos to include in their collections, I was actually literally shocked. So I'd made it on 250 pounds and I'd shot it on a high-8 video camera and I'd edited it. Sari Red was a memorial and a political poetical remembering centering the life of a young South Asian woman, Kalbinder Kaur Hare, who was killed by 3 white racists after they deliberately drove their van straight into her and crushed her against the wall. When making this video, I never even considered existing visual storytelling tropes. I used familiar, culturally specific signs and symbols to create the mise-en-scène of this loss and bereavement, of mourning and grief. In her book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, Christina Sharp writes about what she calls woke work and defines it as something that, quote, utilizes art, writing, and other forms of creative expression to imagine alternative futures and to make the impossible possible. There are many women in history who have made the impossible possible. In 1991, I made A Place of Rage featuring Alice Walker, Angela Davis, and June Jordan, and explored their role as artists and activists in shaping the movement for civil rights in the US. Just a short clip. Okay.
Came across a needle and soon she did the same. At home there were 70-year-old boys and their idea of fun is being in a gang called the Disciples, high on crack until the machine gun.
When I was growing up, I could not travel from one state to the other in this country because I couldn't, you know what I mean? I couldn't assume I could use the bathroom. You know, I couldn't get a glass of water or a cup of coffee or anything in one place to the other. I'm just talking about going from state to state, or even outside the city of New York. You know, someplace else. I mean, things have changed absolutely in my lifetime, and they changed because we made them change.
When the Black Panther Party began to say that it would defend the black community, that it would not put up with police crimes, police brutality, that struck a chord and attracted who knows how many thousands, tens of thousands of people, and I was one of them. Hurricane and a ripper sealing off a church and killed everyone inside. You turn on the telly and every other story is telling you somebody died. My sister killed her baby cause she couldn't afford to feed it. People sending people to the moon. In September my cousin tried reefer for the very first time. Now it's doing horse, it's June. Young people of any color really have to know their history and their past because they don't want to repeat it. They want to build on it. They want it to be better than what their ancestors had, if it can be. And one way of making sure that it's better is to know all of the bad things about it that you don't want to do over.
All these three women that you just saw have had a profound impact on me, and all these women have made the impossible possible through their poetry, writing, and activism. Making the impossible possible was a key component of Maud's 1991 mixed media installation, Hysteria. Hysteria is a character loosely based on the life and history of the artist Edmonia Lewis, who was born in 1844 and died in 1907. She was a celebrated 19th century sculptor of African American and Native American heritage. This is from Maud's archive at the Tate. In the essay by Michelle Cliff I mentioned earlier, She defined Edmonia Lewis, quote, as the first woman of colour who we know whose work as a visual artist was recognised by the dominant culture of her time. During her life as a sculptor, she was confronted with the objectification of herself as black and female. Lewis was seen as a wonder, a work of art in herself, a curiosity. Hysteria was produced in 1991 when Maud was artist-in-resident at Tate Gallery in Liverpool. That same year, Maud organised a day-long symposium titled Hysteria, a symposium on women's art history in an age of mapping. Maud invited me to give a presentation of part of the kick-off session in the morning. The theme of the session was Picturing the Disappeared. Lubaina Himid gave the first paper titled The Black Object in the White Museum, and I followed with the second paper titled That Moment of Emergence. This is, on the right is the program of the day, and on the left, street level, mounted a whole exhibition called Hysteria. I'm not sure what year that was, but I just thought it'd be good to have the Glasgow connection in there. Maud was a determined archaeologist, digging deep to find dispersed fragments in archives on Edmonia Lewis. With sensitive brushstrokes dusting off the erasures, she proceeded to create what African-American cultural historian Sadie Hartman calls archival fabulation, a term coined in response to the limits of official archives. Quote, the use of storytelling and speculative narration as a means of redressing history's omissions. Maud had written, having achieved a successful career, she, Edmonia Lewis, disappeared. And here it is, the recurrent preoccupation with the theme of disappearance in Maud's body of work. Refusing this disappearance, Maud willed Edmonia back into history through her imaginary. In a series of photographs, Maud cast herself as the central character, the artist Hysteria, and invited Bernardine Evaristo, Lubaina Himid, Delta Street, and Miles Danso to take on semi-fictional characters from Hysteria's life. By collaborating with contemporary artists in her artistic milieu, Maud created a continuum from the past through to the present and established firmly the tenacity and lineage of black women's creativity. There's a chapter on Maud in a forthcoming book on Edmonia Lewis by my friend and colleague Jennifer Brodie, a professor at Stanford University. She writes, and I quote, Sulter owes something to Lewis's audacious existence. She, even more than Faith Ringgold, however, must be credited with directly linking her own art and life to Lewis's and claiming the latter as a clear, queer precedent. This methodology of writing and visualizing between the gaps, using the speculative imaginary to presence the absence, is part of a queer worlding many of us were engaged in. Donna Haraway writes of queer worlding as something that is enacted and an embodied way of being in the world. A commitment to making worlds together, not necessarily in the future, but in the here and now. This kind of worlding does not happen in isolation, but in conversation with each other, especially through our art. In my documentary, Kush, centering South Asian LGBTQ experiences, I used a strategy of visual pastiche and montage and deliberately referenced and reworked familiar scenes from classical Bollywood cinema, with the queer diasporic imagination. Gayatri Gopinath writes in her book Impossible Desires, quote, "In so doing, Kush both documented and hailed into being queer diasporic desires, embodiments and subjectivities. Now, over 3 decades after its release, Kush stands as an invaluable archive of South Asian queer diasporic formation, its pleasures, possibilities, and its limits at the moment of its inception." Short clip. So it's a very old Bollywood movie, and that's why it's kind of got archival sort of texture to it. To give some context, the original film had at its centre a king who these women were dancing for. However, I deleted his male gaze and inserted the erotic, dreamlike tableau of the 2 women in early stages of queer desire. These kinds of archival adjustments, as I call them, are necessary, given how institutional archives are too often constituted from points of view structured by a patriarchal gaze and/or violent colonial fantasies. Maud challenged the colonial fantasy in Erasure of Jeanne Duvel, a black woman born in Paris and who was French poet Baudelaire's muse and mistress. Maud's fascination with Jeanne Duvel began in 1988 with a visceral response to a Felix Nada photograph captioned "Unknown Woman." Nada was a friend of Baudelaire. So that the black and white image on the edge of this collage by Maud is Jeanne Duvel. Maud said, "There she stared at me, willing me to give her a name and an identity, a voice. So for over a decade, I've been image making with her in mind, from Calipio in Zabat in 1989 to Les Bijoux in 2002. Maud's project title, Les Bijoux, translated as The Jewels, comes from a poem by Baudelaire. According to historical records, Baudelaire loved Jeanne Duvel, but this did not deter him in his poetry from perpetuating the stereotype of the hypersexual black woman who only existed to please her white master and thus denying her her full humanity. Equally heinous was Baudelaire demanding that the painter Gustave Courbet erase Jeanne Duvel from his autobiographical painting with a really long title, The Painter's Studio, a real allegory determining a phase of 7 years of my artistic life, 1855. So that's the painting of 7 years of his artistic life in his studio and all the people who would come and go. And he had, next to Baudelaire, he had painted originally an image of Jeanne Duvel. But Baudelaire demanded that Duvel be erased after he'd quarreled with her. In this mean and vengeful act, we see the power of the colonial white man to erase a black woman he supposedly loved, to vanish her from a historic painting. Today, this painting hangs in Musée d'Orsay in Paris. I think, personally, that Musée d'Orsay should be petitioned to hang Maud's series Les Bijoux next to Courbet's painting as an act of reparation to Jean Duvel. Of all of Maud's work, Les Bijoux for me is ferocious in its impact. In this series of self-portraits, Maud confidently performs Jean Duvel. Exuding an elegant, stunning defiance, a defiance Jean Duvel herself might have had. Here we see Jean as imagined by Maud as a woman in control of her own sexual power. This is archival fabulation in brilliant action. These images of Maud performing Jean Duvel reminds me of what Bell Hooks once said. Looking is a political act. The gaze is not a passive act of watching. It is an active and rebellious way to confront and resist oppression, and to create a more inclusive and just reality. What I have touched on today is only the tip of Maud's extremely productive oeuvre. In sketching out some of the connective tissues between our parallel artistic trajectories, I hope what has emerged is the complex matrix of overlapping thematic passions, a circularity that conjoins narratives of presence and visibility. When discussing Edmonia Lewis, Maud had pointed out, she disappeared. It can happen to any of us. In ensuring black women be center stage, their work bought by museums, and their names included in dominant narratives of art histories, Maud made sure that her name and her work would not disappear, that we would not need to look for clues to piece together her story. Hers is a story of artistic resilience and imaginative defiance. And the vision of this legacy annual lecture, I think, is a brilliant way forward to continue to engage and keep alive the life and work of Maud Sulter and its contemporary resonance. Thank you.